Welcome to the 13th of these RIO video demonstrations. In this one we'll be looking at RIO functionality to support the Mental Health Act. We'll look at how it supports identification of the patient's current Mental Health Act status, supports upload of Mental Health Act documents. We'll look at the process for recall of the patient under a CTO, identification of the patient's nearest relative, organisation of mental health review tribunals, and support for warning about Mental Health Act expiry dates and consent to treatment. Let's begin by having a look at the way that RIO can identify that the patient is detained under the Act. As you can see, we're looking at the bed view in RIO, and the configurable data which displays alongside the bed view can, for example, show the patient's Mental Health Act status, and in the example we're looking at on screen here you can see that's been configured as a hyperlink which would allow us to navigate straight through to the client sections page, assuming we have the rights to view that page. Adjacent bed there, we'll see that the patient there has no current detention, indicated by the display that there is no data. Let's have a look at that within the context also of a case record. I'm going to open up a clinical record and show you how that data can display in the case record. So here I've configured a patient summary to show Mental Health Act status, and we can see that I've configured that to contain two panels, one showing the patient's current Mental Health Act status and the other one displaying the patient's consent status. These summaries can be configured to be made available to end users subject to the service they work in, and I can choose to configure that into my view of the case record if it's useful for me to be able to see that summary view of the patient's Mental Health Act status. Let's move to the navigation tab in the record and have a look at support for document upload within RIO. I'm going to go into the document list view, and here we can see a list of currently uploaded documents in this record, and what I want to draw your attention to here is the document type pick list, and you'll see that in my list of document types I've got an option for Mental Health Act documents. On the record we're looking at here we can see there have been no documents of that type uploaded, but that's the document type description which would allow me to upload scanned Mental Health Act documentation. These are locally configurable pick lists, and if it was useful to have a further distinction amongst Mental Health Act documents to determine particular types of Mental Health Act documentation, that menu could show corresponding menu items. Let's have a look at support for scheduling Mental Health Act review tribunal. I'm going to come to the Mental Health Act folder in my record, and we'll see that I've got an option there for Mental Health Act scheduling, and here is a pick list offering me appeal types which I might want to record. If I click go, I'll then be able to associate the tribunal or meeting which I'm scheduling against a particular event. In this example we can see that the patient's currently detained under a section 17A, and clicking go will then bring up the screen which will allow me to schedule a hearing date and time, a mandatory field there to specify the hearing venue, and a free text comment field there which will allow me to attach any notes against this meeting. Also a mandatory field here to record who the application has been made by. So that's the screen which will allow me to initiate the process of recording a Mental Health Act review tribunal. Let's just populate some data into there so that you can see what that screen looks like when it's got some data in and when I've saved it. Let's suppose that this is going to be scheduled for the 26th of November. I can then free text in the description of the venue which we're going to be using. I can attach a comment there if I wish to, and I can record that this application is being made by the client, and when I click save then we'll see that we've got the summary information displaying on the screen there, and additional buttons generated at the bottom which will allow me to build an iterative record of any reports which have been requested to support the meeting, people who've been invited to attend the meeting, to be able to provide a description of the panel who's going to hear the appeal, and when that has happened, to record the outcome of that appeal. Let's have a look at one of the other tools that supports the work of Mental Health Act administrators in administering the Act, and that is the Mental Health Act to-do list. So this allows me to search either on a per client basis, use a pair of date fields to look at from and to dates in a time window, to specify whether I'm looking at one or multiple hospital sites, and to specify particular tasks. So let's suppose I'm interested in looking for section renewal dates, and if I were to populate in a to date here to the end of the month, for example, and then view that report, it will pull back a list of section renewal dates. If I sort by the due date of those renewals, then we'll see up at the top of the list the ones which are going to fall due in the last part of November. Obviously, as you can see, I'm logged into a training type environment with a lot of data dating back over time, which we would not expect to see in a live system. But here we've used the task of section renewal date, run that to the end of the month to pull back patients whose section renewal dates are going to fall due in that time, and you'll see that this list supports two hyperlinks, one being a link to the patient's case record, and the other one will be a link to the specific screen where we can record details of the task that we're being prompted about. Let's look at how that can also support finding consent to treatment due dates, for example. So let's pull up that report instead. So you'll see the corresponding change to the task that the hyperlink is provided for, and options obviously to sort by due date. And as you can see, I run that report without populating any date parameters, but I could be looking in a narrower window to find specific periods of time in which consent is going to fall due. I want to show you also another way in which RIO can prompt and provide support over tasks which are going to fall due, and that's by using the to-do list or RIO notifications. And if we scroll down on this screen, just wanted to show as an example here, here's a prompt which has been fired off when a Mental Health Act consent has been added against a client record, and that's just used the function of a RIO notification which is fired on the trigger of that consent being added. But these notifications could be warnings of events which are going to occur in the future, such as expiry dates of sections or consent falling due, and they can be targeted to named individuals as required. Let's move on now to the more complex journeys involved in the Mental Health Act, beginning with the civil requirements outlined in the East London document. We'll start by looking at options to record section 136 and then move the patient through a journey where they are regraded to a section 2, appeal to a tribunal, or regraded to a section 3, show how consent to treatment dates are supported, and also appeal to the hospital managers. I'm going to begin with the section 136. As you can see, I'm now looking at a case record and just reminding you about that summary tab which I've got displaying in this case record, indicating that the patient currently has no Mental Health Act information to be viewed. Coming back to the navigation tab, and I'm going to come into my Mental Health Act folder and come to the client section option. As we've seen, this patient is not currently detained, and I've got a pick list here where I can choose the section which I want to work with, and in this example it's going to be section 136. When I click to submit, the client section page will load up, and we can then enter some mandatory data, obviously on the start date and time of this. Now, for the purposes of our demonstration, I'm going to backdate this by some time so that we can run this scenario forwards. So I'm going to begin that on the 1st of November in 2011. In the example of section 136, we'll see that the admission legal status field is providing me with the options either for the context where I might be recording historic information, or in the example I'm going to use here, I'm going to be recording that this is a non-inpatient section. We'll look at the rest of this screen in detail as we go through the demonstration, but these are the mandatory fields which I need to provide information to in order that I can save on this screen. And we'll now see that RIO has made the calculation of the next expiry date based on the rules that are configured in the background. So in the example we're looking at here, the 72-hour period then due to expire on the 4th of November 2011. I've admitted the patient to the ward so that we can proceed to the next part of the scenario, and we're going to look at how the section 136 can now be regraded. You'll see that once I've saved on this page, I've got options to regrade, and I'm then provided with a pick list, and again background configuration in RIO providing me with options that allow me to regrade from the 136 to a section 2. And when I click submit there, we'll then be back to the client section screen when I can record as a mandatory field the start date and time of this period of detention. So I'm going to do that from the 2nd of November, and again backdating that so that we've got time to roll this scenario forwards. Mandatory fields here for me to provide the identities of the two people making recommendations, and let's scroll down and have a look at some of the other fields here. You'll see that I've got fields here that allow me to record the identity of an approved mental health professional involved in the application, and the option to state who has made the application, whether that's been by the approved mental health professional or the nearest relative. There are fields here which allow me to record any processes that take place where a nearest relative is displaced, and RIO would allow any extensions to section dates when an outcome of that process is recorded, should they apply. And the next expiry date and time field, which will be populated with read-only information when we save on this field. Underneath that, you'll see that I've got a field to record details of any forms which have been received, and again pick lists in RIO locally configurable so that appropriate lists of forms and leaflets can be seen on the relevant section screens. And as you can see in the example below there, I can record details of information leaflets given to the patient, and between those two fields for forms and leaflets you'll see I've got options here to record the date and time at which patient's rights have been explained under section 132. We can capture the identity of the person doing that, whether that's an HCP known to RIO or whether it's provided by a service external to RIO staff, in which case I can record that as having been done by a non-HCP. I've got a comment field there where I can supplement the pick list, and again locally configurable options would be available there to determine the level of the patient's understanding and amplify that with a comment. You can also capture here whether they've been informed about independent mental health advocacy. Below that I've got a free text field which will allow me to record any comments associated to this section, and right down at the bottom of the screen my option to record a section end date and time with an associated pick list for reasons that a section may be recorded as having ended. So we've populated the mandatory information on this field, and at that point I can click to save. Once we've saved on that screen, we'll be able to see that RIO has calculated the expiry dates for the section, and we can now see that expiring on the 29th of November, so the 28-day period provided for by the Act. I'm going to look now at the process for recording an appeal, a manager's appeal in this example. So I'm going to use the patient's hyperlink to take me into the main part of the case record and navigate to the Mental Health Act folder and come to the Mental Health Act scheduling page for hearings. And here's the option that I want to schedule a manager's hearing, and here is my option to associate that against the current period of detention for this patient. So we'll populate some data in here so that we can see a save on this screen. And as I showed you earlier on, I've got a free text field here which is mandatory for me to record details of the venue, so I'll populate some information into that field. And when I save on this screen, I'll get a prompt for any mandatory fields which I've failed to complete in this example, recording who has made the application. And when I click to save, we'll now have the buttons which I referred to earlier on in terms of being able to record information about reports that have been requested, attendees to the meeting, the panel, and at the conclusion of that meeting, the option to record the outcome which has occurred. I'm going to move on now to the part of the scenario dealing with the regrade of this section to section 3. So I'm going to navigate back to the Mental Health Act screen that we've been working with. I'm doing that from the case record context, but just before I navigate to that page, just to mention that that can also be provided from a top menu here, and I could be navigating from the menu option there, which would require me to search for the patient. So let's come back into the client section screen for this patient with the saved section 2 information there, and click the button to regrade this section. And as before, I'll be presented with a list of sections that it's lawful for me to be regrading to from the section 3. The option I want is the section 3. When I click submit, we're then back on the client section screen with the options here for us to provide the mandatory information, in particular starting with the section start date and time. So once again, I'm going to backdate the start date of this section so that it's going to follow on from that section 2 which we've just been working with. So I'll record this regrade as taking place on the 28th of November, populate a time into that field. You'll see that in the mandatory fields for first and second recommendations, RIO has pulled across the identities which we recorded on the section 2 as a potential time saver for me, but as you can see, I can click into those fields and overwrite that information if I need to. The rest of this screen, as we saw earlier on when we were looking at the process of recording section 2 in terms of my options to be able to record details of forms which have been received, efforts made to provide information to the patient under section 132, and record leaflets which have been given to the patient. So when we click to save here, we'll now see the expiry date populating through, so calculation of the 6-month period for the first period of detention under section 3 expiring in 6 months' time on the 27th of May. I've returned to the Mental Health Act to-do list so that we can see how RIO will prompt for the consent falling due 3 months after the start of that section 3, and as I mentioned before, a variety of ways that we can populate data onto the list. I'm going to show you how that can be done using the option to search for a specific patient. So here's the patient we've just been working with, and if we load that up onto the screen, we'll see that data populated using the filter of all tasks here onto the screen, so including the consent to treatment due falling on the 1st of February 2012. A number of other tasks also populated because of our backdating of the data entry on this screen. Once again, we're asked to show how RIO will support the process of applications to appeal against detentions. I'm going to use that patient name hyperlink to navigate back into the case record and into that Mental Health Act folder and return to the mental health scheduling page. And if I'm wanting to record a manager's hearing, we'll now see that the pick list here updated to reflect the patient's current status as being on section 3, so that any appeals that I schedule now will be associated against that section 3. So won't populate the whole screen again, but just to show you that RIO is now updated the options to me when I'm scheduling the hearing so that it's being associated against the correct section, and would thereby populate an accurate history of appeals against particular parts of a series of detentions. Going to look now at the process for section renewal. So I'm going to return to the client section screen, and again I'm doing that through navigation in the case record. So here's the section details which were populated and saved just now, and in order to record a renewal I must record that a review has taken place, and RIO will calculate the earliest point at which that review can take place. So as long as I populate a date into the review held field, I can then go ahead and click the button to record a renewal of that section. And when that happens, you'll see the page refresh and the next expiry date now populated with the second 6-month period of that section 3 detention now due to expire on the 27th of November. I'm going to turn now and look at the options for recording transfers in and out of RIO. You'll see that at the foot of the client section screen itself I've got a button to invoke a section transfer, and when we click that I'll see a summary display of any current transfer details, and in the example we're looking at here we can see there have been none yet, so I'm going to use the link at the bottom of the page to record a transfer out date. So I will do that within the period of the detention that we've just been working with. So again, going to take that back into the last calendar year so that we can do that. So I'm going to time that as occurring in June, and we'll start that on the 4th of June. And you'll see that this is also supported by either a pick list, which allows me to record a destination, again a locally configurable pick list. If the location which I'm looking for hasn't been populated through to that local pick list, then I've got a search tool available there which would allow me to search for an address and populate full details of an address onto this section transfer screen. Once I've populated that destination, I can click to save, and I'll now get a confirmation message from RIO indicating that the transfer has been successfully recorded, and also a prompt that because the patient's an inpatient, that client should now be discharged. So I'll say OK to that. Now returning to the section transfer details screen, we can see those details which I've just recorded with the transfer out date appearing on the left hand side there. And in the scenario we are now asked to record that the patient is transferred back in from that independent provider. So if I come once again to the section transfer link, I'll have the option to record the converse arrangement of the patient being returned back. So once again, just to retain consistency with the scenario, I'm going to backdate the date entry for that, and we'll record that the patient returned back on June the 18th. And when I click to save there, I'll see this time the confirmation message indicating that we'll be returned to the client section page, and a requirement to save on that screen when we've done so. So here are those section transfer details, now showing both the transfer out date and the date at which we've been transferred back in. So going to move on now and look at the options to record a community treatment order for this patient. So I'm going to come back to the patient's client section screen, and I'm going to do that by navigation from that top menu to the client section screen, just to show you that when I do that process I'll need to search for the patient. Here's the one we want, and we're now returned to that client section screen with the section 3 details. And because the patient is on a section which is suitable to be regraded to a community treatment order, you'll see that I've got the button down at the bottom of the screen here to invoke a community treatment order. And when I click on that, I'll be prompted first of all to provide information to the mandatory field with the start date and time of that period of community treatment. So I'm going to start that from July of 2012, so just going to populate the appropriate dates onto the pick list here. and we'll choose the 2nd of July, commencing at midday. And on this screen, mandatory for me to provide information about who has made the CTO order, and I'm provided with a pick list of those that RIO knows are flagged as being responsible clinicians. Underneath that, you'll see I've got a free text field here which will allow me to record details of any conditions attached against the CTO. If there were a care coordinator already assigned to this patient, that read-only information would pull across onto this screen, and when we save on this screen, expiry dates will then be populated into those read-only fields. Just to also mention regarding the CTO condition field that once we've added conditions here, RIO will support the modification of those conditions and retain a history of anything that's recorded in these fields. So when I click to save here, RIO will then do the calculation regarding the expiry dates for this. So here's my first 6-month period for the community treatment order, now due to expire on the 1st of January 2013. Going to look now at some of the options for recording consent. On the client section screen itself, one of the ways that I can record the consent status would be, for example, to record that we've received the form CTA 12 to certify that the patient's got capacity to consent in CTO context, and I can be date and time stamping that. As I showed you earlier on with regard to the notifications or to-do list in RIO, it's possible to use date fields such as this to trigger warnings and notifications to named individuals that may relate to particular tasks around consent. Let's also have a look at the Mental Health Act to-do list, and we'll see that we've got the option on this pick list here to look at options where consent to treatment falls due to CTO. Now this is currently configured to pull back those satisfying criteria where they are not consenting patients and therefore due to have SOAD visits to establish consent to treatment. So if I refresh my report here, it will now pull back those patients satisfying that criteria for those who are not consenting, and I've got the same options as I explained earlier on, that I can sort that by due date, and options there to drill through either to the client record or to the consent screens themselves to be able to record details of consent. So let's have a look at now the options to record the concurrent section 2 running alongside the community treatment order for this patient. I'm going to use the patient's hyperlink here to drill back through to the case record for this patient and return to the client section screen. So we'll see when we're on the client section screen that we've got the option at the bottom of the screen here to record a concurrent section, and if I click that button again, I'll be provided from the pick list with a list of sections that it's lawful for us to have a concurrent section running against. So finding the option here to record the section 2, and when I click to submit, then we're back on the client section screen as you saw me using this earlier on when we recorded the details of the section 2 originally. So I can populate details onto this screen as I require. So let's suppose this is taking place again, backdating it into the last calendar year, and I'll start that from the 1st of November at 1200 and record into these fields again mandatory details of those people making the recommendations. And at that point I can click to save. RIO will seek to ensure that it keeps admission details up in step with the client section details that I'm recording, and because I haven't discharged this patient, I'm getting the dialogue to say whether I want to update those records or not. I'm going to say no to those options. So we're now returned to the client section screen, but as you can see, that now appears to me as a pick list because the patient has concurrent sections running, and if I need to go into any of those particular details, I can select from the pick list that's available to me on the screen. Moving now to look at the recording of the recall of a section 17, and I'm going to use that pick list to come back into the relevant screen to work with that. So we're now looking at the details that were recorded for that CTO, and you'll see I've got a button down at the bottom to record a recall of that CTO. So I'm going to click that button, and we'll then record, first of all, in a mandatory field, the recall method, so the mode of delivery to the patient of that recall. So let's suppose that we're going to do this hand delivered directly to the client, and we'll be date and time stamping that. Again, need to wind the clock back into last year to be able to record this scenario. So we'll record that as having occurred on the 19th of November. And because that's been hand delivered directly to the client, I'll also be able to use that option to record that that's the actual recall start and date time. So mandatory also for me to record the identity of the person who's made that recall, and then I've got fields where I can either choose the checkbox here to record that the patient is in fact currently an inpatient, which is what I'm going to use because in fact I haven't discharged this patient yet, but you'll see that I could be recording that the patient has been recalled to another location. That's a locally defined pick list, so it would be possible to support recording of recall to other locations other than an inpatient setting, and I've also got the address search there if I'm not able to find the location I want from the pick list. So I'll save on this screen, and because I haven't discharged the patient, again getting the dialogues to try and validate the admission dates, so I'll say no to that and no to that, and then I'll just get a confirmation that I'll have mismatching dates. I'm going to proceed with that basis for the purposes of our demonstration. So on the client section screen now, we can see a banner appears at the top of the screen indicating that the patient was recalled, and also giving us the expiry period of that recall. And as we can see, RIO's calculated that so that it calculates the 72 hours from the time which I recorded the recall as being effective from, giving me the 72-hour expiry period on the 22nd of November. Let's look now at the process for recording an outcome to that recall. So button at the foot of the screen there allows me to go in and record the outcome of this. So I'll need to mandatorily record the decision date for this. So let's navigate back to last November and record the decision date and time for outcome of this recall. And we're going to record that this is being revoked, so we'll select the appropriate option in the pick list, and as you can see I can supplement that with a comment field that takes free text. So when I save that, I'll get the confirmation dialog asking me if I want to revoke the CTO, and then returned to the client section screen, and if we return to the section 3 which I recorded, we'll see that the expiry date's now recalculated to reflect the status having followed on from the CTO being revoked. I'm going to look now at the process for recording that the patient is AWOL, and I'm going to begin by showing you how that appears on the bed view. So let's navigate back to the bed view where we can see our patient Sam in bed number 9, and when I click on the bed, brings up a context menu for me which allows me to record, admit, discharge, transfer, leave type functions, and because the patient's detained I'll have the option to record an absent without leave. Coming into that screen I need to record the date and time when that's occurred, so we're going to record this 3 months later in February, and I'll record that the patient was noticed as being absent at midday on the 1st of February. I've got a pick list here for risk category. Now in this configuration it's referring me to look at the risk assessment, but it's a locally configurable list, and you could therefore be offering people options to record a risk category according to local descriptions relating to risk. You'll see also fields here that I would use in the event that I record a return from that period of absence, and a pick list reason to record a reason why that period of absence without leave has come to an end. So let's save on this screen and we'll be returned to the bed view, and the bed view now augmented with the icon of the pair of trainers there, and we'll see the text description appearing alongside the bed indicating that the patient is AWOL. So in addition to the trainer icon, which is RIO's icon to indicate absent without leave, we also see that text description appearing alongside the bed, as you can see on screen there. So in the scenario, the patient then returns from leave after a period of a further 5 months. So let's come back into that screen so that we can record the details of that return from absent without leave. So this will now be in July, so let's record a date for that in July of this year. And here's the pick list I mentioned just now to support end reasons. So let's suppose that the patient has been returned to the ward by the police. As you can see, I can also supplement the pick list with a free text comment. Clicking save there will return me back to the bed view and back to the standard occupied bed icon, and you'll see the text alongside the bed now updated to reflect that the patient is no longer absent without leave. So we now need to look at the process for recording a renewal of the patient's detention. So let's come back through to the client section screen. Obviously still got that concurrent section there because I haven't end dated that, hence the pick list. So if we come back into the section 3, I now need to record that there has been a review held. I'm just going to take the date on screen here as the earliest possible date. Obviously in the real world in this scenario it's unlikely that it would have been done at that time. And I'm going to then click the button to renew that section. So still got the pick list there. If we come back into that screen, we'll see that the expiry date now updated to the 19th of November. And we'll then look to re-invoke the CTO. So clicking the button there would then take me back round to the process which you've now already seen, whereby I can date and timestamp the start of the period of CTO. Returning now to the case record, let's have a look at support for section 117. Again, going to come back into this Patient's Mental Health Act folder, and you'll see that we have a form configured in RIO to support data capture around section 117. And if I open up a new instance of this form, unremarkable form really, but mandatory date and time field for the form, and then data capture to date and timestamp a period of eligibility for section 117. Hyperlink, as you can see here, to take me through to the client section screen. And I also wanted to mention in this connection that the review of section 117, which might typically take place through the CPA process, just wanted to take you into one of the configuration screens for RIO. So not a screen which end users will generally see, something that system administrators are able to work with. What I'm showing you on this screen is the configuration screen for a CPA review, and you'll see that on the top half of the screen we've got a series of text fields which would appear on my CPA review with the labels which I've determined there. But as we scroll down here, you'll see that one of my options in configuring the way that my CPA review screen appears is to configure whether I want to display section 117 entitlement on that screen, and that will also allow me to record at the point of the CPO review an intentional decision to either continue with section 117 or to record an end date for that, which, supported with the end date in the form, would allow us to maintain accurate records of patients subject to section 117 at any point. Moving now to the second scenario with regard to court directed sections, we're going to look at the application of section 35 and how that can be applied concurrently with section 3. We'll look at how expiry dates, consent dates and appeals can be recorded in relation to those, the extension of a section 35, use of a section 37 and again associated expiry dates. Looking now then at recording the section 35, I'm going to start with a patient who's already admitted to the ward so that we won't go through that process of recording the admission, and I'll use the link to the Mental Health Act section page to drill through from the bed view and begin with selecting the relevant section that we want to use. So I'm going to choose that first option there in the section 35 part of that list to record a remand to hospital for a report. So clicking submit on that screen, I'll then be entering the start date and time for this. So I'm going to record this as starting on September the 9th from 1200, and because the patient's already on the ward, I'll record them as having been detained following a period of informal admission. And I've got a pick list there that I can record the identity of the responsible clinician there. And I'll also record the 3-week period that we're asked to in the scenario, so that will end on the 30th of September. And I'll now be able to click to save on this screen, and as you've seen in previous parts of this demonstration, RIO now displaying the expiry date as read-only information on this screen. We're asked to show how we'll be able to record a concurrent section 3, and as you saw earlier on, once we've saved on the client section screen for relevant sections, I'll have a concurrent section button available to me, and I can then make a selection from that. So I could record a concurrent section 3, and let's record that as having started in October also, or even September rather, so that we can show it is concurrent from the 23rd of September. Mandatory for me to record the details of the first and second recommendations for that section, and I can then save on this screen. And as you saw earlier on, where we've got concurrent sections in place, the client section screen then displays a pick list so that we can select which one we want to go back into to do any work with. Let's just look at the process for recording an appeal against that. So as you saw earlier on, navigating through the Mental Health Act folder in the client record, and I can go to the MHA hearings scheduling tool, and in this instance wanting to use the pick list to record that that's going to be an appeal to a tribunal. And as you'll see, because we've got 2 current sections in operation, the pick list there to allow me to associate the appeal against the relevant section. And as you saw, just the same details as you saw me populating onto that screen previously, with the mandatory requirement minimum to enter the details of the hearing venue. So that would be the process to record an appeal to the tribunal as I described earlier on. I'm going to now return to the client section screen to look at the renewal of the section 35. So let's navigate back to the client section screen and open up that to have a look at the section 35. So we need to record that the review has taken place. So I'll populate a date and time onto that field there, and I will now have the option to click to renew that. Slightly different behaviour being displayed here because this is going to be directed by the court to populate the expiry date and time. So consistent with the scenario, I'm going to populate details in there to see that running on for the relevant length of time. And when I then click to renew, that will be saved on the screen. If we come back into the section 35, we'll see that expiry date which I've just populated in there now displaying as read-only information on that screen. In the last part of these scenarios, we'll be looking at the journey where a prisoner is directed to be detained in a hospital and the use of section 4849, how that can be applied with a concurrent section 3, and how the system will handle a return to prison and then section 4749 and eventually a release date being seen. And we'll also have a look at the consent screens which we've not looked at so far during this demonstration. Let's begin by looking at the recording of the section 48 and 49. As you can see, I'm back at the inpatient view and I've got a patient already admitted in a bed which I'm going to use again just to save time for demonstration purposes. So I'm going to drill through on that Mental Health Act section link by the bed and locate the part of the Act that we want to use. So section 48 and 49. When I click submit, as you'll be familiar with by now, we're looking at the section screen relevant for the section that's been selected, in this case section 48 and 49. So I'm going to start that from March, which should allow me time to work through the steps in this scenario, and just for convenience I'm going to use the admitted informally option here because I've already got my patient in the bed. So when I click save there, we'll see that the screen now updated with read-only information concerning the section start date up at the top. You'll see that fields underneath there which will generate display when we record any reviews which have occurred, and the rest of this screen similar to that which we've seen in previous parts of these scenarios. Let's look now at the options to record a concurrent section. So using that concurrent section button and then locating the section 3 which we wish to apply concurrently for this. When I click submit, we'll be to the client section details screen where I can populate a start date and time for this section. And as you've seen me doing before, mandatory for me to record the identities of the first and second people making the recommendations for the detention. At that point I've populated the mandatory fields and I can click to save, and as you saw earlier on, where concurrent sections are in operation, in that situation the client section screen will provide the pick list to enable me to select which of those sections I may wish to be working with. Let's have a look now at the Mental Health Act to-do list to show how we can be prompted for consent to be recorded for this patient. So let's bring up the to-do list and I'll search this time for the patient that we want, and let's have a look at the consent to treatment due status. So we'll see that there are 2 dates displaying here relating to the 2 detentions currently applying to this patient, and we can see the 3-month rule being calculated from the start of the section 3 that you saw me applying just now. Returning now to the client section screen, and I'm going to come back into the 4849 and look at how we can record the end of that section. So if we scroll down on the screen here, we'll see that we've got a field here to record the section end time, and I'll record that as ending on the 1st of April. And you'll see that I've got an associated pick list here that I can use to record the reason why that section has ended. So in this instance I'm going to choose that the patient has been returned to prison, and when I click to save I'll get a confirmation message from RIO confirming that it's about to record the end of the section and any associated consents. So I'll say yes to that. We're now returned to the client section screen, and obviously as I've already recorded the concurrent section 3, no pick list now generated, and we're straight back to the section screen where we can see details of the current section 3. Going to have a look now at how we can apply the section 4749. So I'm using the section pick list generated by the concurrent section option on the client section page, and familiar to you by now the need for us to provide a mandatory start date and time for that. So I'm going to start that from October. I'm going to start that from the beginning of October. And you'll see again same options to update legal status if I require to do that there. And the same fields that you've seen me working with throughout these demonstrations. So if I click to save at that point, then we'll be back in the situation we've seen just now, where because I've got that section 3 still applied on this record, I've got the pick list to choose which section I wish to go into. So let's open the screen back up for that section 4749, and we'll now have a look at the option to record consents associated with a period of detention. We've looked at the way that RIO can prompt for those consents, and I want to now look at the actual screens themselves. I've chosen in this particular configuration to have those structured within a medication folder and to have a hyperlink pointing me to the Mental Health Act and ECT consent screens in RIO, but that's a configuration decision, and you could have that sitting within a Mental Health Act folder or anywhere else that was logical for you in your configuration and to support the way that your practices work in the organisation. Here we are on the consent to treatment summary screen, and on this record we can see that there are no current consent details under any of these headings. So let's have a look at the option to record consent to medication, and on all these consent screens we'll see that the recording of consent will be preceded by the option to record a capacity decision for the patient in regard to consent to medication. So let's have a look at the option here. If I record that the patient has capacity, and if I record that they are consenting to their medication, I can date and timestamp that at the appropriate point. I'm going to record that from the 1st of October just for the purposes of our demonstration here. And when I click go, I'll then be able to record the details of the T2 form for the consenting patient and date and timestamp when that T2 form has been completed. And I can record the type of person who has completed that form, for example the responsible clinician, and then I've got a free text field there in which I can enter details around the person who has completed the form. When we click save, we're then returned to that consent summary screen, and this time we can see in read only the details that have been recorded, the section that was current at the time of consent that I've just recorded, and those details which I populated onto that screen as I recorded that. Finally, we want to look at recording the end date for this section, so I'm going to navigate again back to the case record for this patient and to the Mental Health Act folder, come back into the client section screen, and we'll come back into that section 4749, and you'll see me earlier on use the end date time fields on this screen. So this time I can populate a date in and record that, for example, as having ended on the 1st of November, and an associated pick list to choose a suitable reason for that, such as discharge from the Ministry of Justice. When I click save, I'll see the same confirmation message again confirming that I'm about to end this section and any associated consents, and I then returned to the client section screen where I can see the concurrent section which still exists on this patient record. So that concludes our Mental Health Act functionality demonstrations in this video. Hope you found that useful, and thank you if you've stayed with us all the way from recording number 1.